is the down button. Yeah, cool. All right. Hi everyone. I also went to Defcon with Tessa and attended a talk where someone tried to apply the sort of kill chain paradigm to biosecurity, although on a fair number of the steps in it I kind of questioned the applicability. Yeah?
What's kill chain?
Yeah, you can get into that. Oh, sorry, I'm using the wrong button. Alright, kill chain is a paradigm where you're assuming that a targeted attack has a set of phases that are these broadly defined steps that most attackers are going to go through. And it started out, I think, as a military concept related to the structure of an attack, like targeting or like limiting someone's movement, that kind of thing. And cyber kill chain is this thing. Is there a light on this one? Cool. Okay, so I'm just going to sort of walk through this diagram here. First phase is reconnaissance, which is sort of looking through and, I don't know, trying to work out what you already know about, what you can find out just online, like email addresses of someone you're trying to target or something. Weaponization, which is where you're carrying sort of a way in with a payload that's going to cause whatever variety of damage or infiltration that you want, or at least the first step of it. Delivery, which is sort of getting that to the target, possibly using the email addresses you gave here. Exploitation, which is using a vulnerability in their system to execute code that shouldn't be there. Installation, which is sort of getting further code that lets you have more control over your client. And control, which is when you kind of have some control over the client, and then finally, sort of, did you achieve your original objective, which was probably the reason you tried to hack it in the first place. And for cybersecurity, this mostly, I think in a lot of cases this works. There's some cases where some of these steps are going to be skipped, and there are other papers about how this doesn't always apply even in cybersecurity, but it seems broadly true, and it seems like it can be useful to think about sort of what you can do at different intervention points. This is kind of an optional slide, and I think I'll get back to it if there's time, but you know, things like, I guess one thing I should maybe define is chatter is sort of, if you know who's likely to try to hack you, like if you're the government and you know that there's this anarchist group over here that's full of hackers, trying to watch what you can of their like talk with each other, like if they have a forum or something, that might be called chatter. Or if you like know where they're located and you know that there's streams of messages coming in and out, even if they're encrypted, you can just watch how often that's happening in order to guess when an attack might happen. But the rest I think is fairly self-explanatory. So cyber kill chain also can be thought of in comparison to the other like default paradigm, which I think is probably even more typical, which is sort of perimeter defense. And the kill chain is sort of used to highlight that there are these other additional points of intervention, but it kind of integrates the perimeter defense idea inside of it. So perimeter defense is basically exactly what it sounds like. It's the idea that you want to control who can get in, and if they're in, you want to control what they can access. So it's sort of the paradigm that results in a lot of, or it's a paradigm that matches up with a lot of things like sort of using authorization in order to access sensitive locations or sensitive files. And sort of in the language of the cyber kill chain, perimeter defense is focusing entirely on these two steps, delivery and exploitation. And I think for both of them, the recommendation is just that you primarily focus on these two because they're the most actionable steps most of the time. And on top of that, there are also steps before the person has gotten into your system. So while you might be able to do a lot if you know they're in your system, they might have already gotten what they were going for. Perimeter defense in biology is mostly just hygiene. Like, hygiene is a very obvious example of sort of exactly this kind of thought process. So, you know, carefully handling potentially hazardous things like human waste and not putting it where your food is. just like everything everyone learned in grade school about to get less sick. Not dumping sewer where your drinking water is, and having these like specialized containers for biomaterials. And on a different scale, sort of, like viruses have anchor proteins, and sort of, on a different scale, I think you could think in a similar way about sort of how they get into cells and that kind of thing. That we can't. We have like our elaborate immune system, but for single-celled organisms, like they might be able to evolve away from this, or might be able to, I guess, once it's inside, restrict its ability to access ribosomes. Would I guess be an example of the thing that Jeffrey was talking about earlier. So biosecurity kill chain is used in a talk by Mr. Brimley. I'm not going to pronounce the leak. And it consisted of a set of like, it was kind of similar to the cyber kill chain, but included a couple of steps that were different. And and he didn't use it, but I'm going to add back in actions on objective because it applies to all of them. So reconnaissance, self-explanatory. It's the same thing, like limiting what information you make public. That will make it easier for people to exploit you. Development. So he made some assumptions for these three here that I think don't necessarily hold up. And I'm going to talk about that near the end, but I'm going to talk through the thought process that seemed to result in these particular things in his presentation. So development people need lab equipment, and if they're going to do gene synthesis, they need reagents, and that might be the limiting and hard to get component. Weaponization, which is sort of taking something already known to be hazardous and making it more hazardous or more deliverable or something. So like he had thought that maybe a turning point would be high biosafety level labs, but like people are probably going to forgo that. And I think in practice this doesn't always happen. Like infective agents are already infective agents is basically true. And production, he thought that if you want to target a lot of people, you might need to do production scale. I think this probably isn't necessary. I think the weird thing about biology is that it kind of multiplies itself. If you wanted to make a very large amount of something that like didn't just happen in nature, you might have this problem. But I think if I had to omit one of them, this is probably the most likely one I would. Like when I think of biological weapons of mass destruction, it's kind of a poor person's WMD, but also your starting material can be very small and you can still do a lot of damage. And so like his assumption that you might need large scale bioreactors just like doesn't seem true to me. So then delivery or infection, self-explanatory, honestly. And you have the trade-off of like aerosol is easy, but it's extremely indiscriminate, and injection is hard, but at least it's targeted. Maybe some chatter about delivery mechanisms, and then there's actions on objective, and I'm going to look at like the tiny handful of extant cases of basically home lab bioterrorism. Look at that. So how does it actually describe those? Okay, I'm going to start with the 1984 Ranch-Nishi attack. And basically what happened with that one was that followers of a religious movement tried to skew a county election by deliberately infecting 10 salad bars with salmonella. There was like a cult, and they were being impacted by some rules being passed by a nearby town that distinctly did not like them. And they wanted that to stop. And some of them cared about this a lot. And so how well did these fit? Reconnaissance? I mean, they selected restaurants that had salad bars. This was actually what I think he wrote in his talk too. It's like, that's pretty easy. Yeah, development was skipped. They just purchased salmonella from a medical supply company. But in theory, you can just swab raw chicken. Like, it's going to be very hard to control the spread of salmonella. It's basically food sickness. Weaponization was skipped. They used standard unaltered salmonella. Cultured in a home lab, although given the description some of the people who investigated the lab gave, I'm actually like maybe inclined to update the direction of it was a better lab than I initially expected, and then his talk seemed to illustrate it as. delivery. They visited restaurants. They added salmonella into the salad dressing. They got a bunch of food workers arrested. Or at least cut them things of job things. And actions on objective. 751 people got sick. 45 people got hospitalized. Some of them nearly died. Like there was a like newborn child somewhere on that list. It wasn't great. But the people in the city really disliked the Rajneeshis, so they still lost all 3 county positions and were suspected by the locals, including some of the politicians. Like they messaged, I think, the CDC and things about the fact that, hey, I kind of think these people might have been behind that. They were mostly brushed off. Like this did not actually. I think they only ended up finding out that these people were behind it after the main guy of the cult, what was it, Rajneesh, after he said that his secretary probably had done criminal acts and could somebody go check out go investigate their lab. So it took internal divisions in the cult for them to actually take this theory seriously. Because while it was the biggest salmonella outbreak that year, like salmonella outbreaks happen all the time, and presumably epidemiologists are somewhat versed in statistics and that kind of thing. So if there's an opposite of paranoia, they probably have it. And like, I don't know, being too aware of the fact that you're filtering for extreme cases and that kind of thing. So that was interesting. Then there was the 2001 Amerithrax attacks, which I'm assuming most people have heard of. And in this case, a scientist in a biodefense lab sent letters that had anthrax spores folded up in letters that had pseudo-jihadist threats to several news outlets and Democratic senators. And it took them like 7 years to find the guy. So again, I'm like, looking this up did cause me to update the direction of it. It's fairly hard to track. It's harder to track people down than I would think, and I really, really hope like the people who have stores of these dangerous microbes are like tagging them somehow, because it was much harder than I expected it to be to track both these 2 cases down. Kind of makes me wonder if there's a lot of unlisted cases of someone coughing on some politician's doorknob or something. Because like, who's gonna tell? Especially if it's a common thing. But in any case, for Renaissance, also minimal. He used publicly available mailing addresses, and for him, it didn't even matter which particular individuals he was targeting. It was all a false flag operation. Development, he used anthrax from a biodefense research stock, which he had access to because he was working on anthrax and anthrax vaccines and that sort of thing. Weaponization was skipped. He just used the stuff he had. I would hardly even call this production, but yeah, I guess he did make more of the anthrax. And then he mailed some letters. And for his objective, it was a false flag operation, and apparently it wasted a huge amount of FBI time, because they actually took the they assumed it was Al-Qaeda and were trying to find some way to link it back to Al-Qaeda, and that kept not working. But it did increase funding to biodefense, and there was specifically funding towards an anthrax vaccine. He did actually get more, that actually did get more funding as a consequence of this. So, success? He did eventually have people checking his home because they thought he was connected to this, although the evidence was still pretty shaky, and he ended up committing suicide sometime after that. But they might theoretically not have have tracked him down if it hadn't been him doing that, and you can't be 100% sure there wasn't a second person involved. So, points of intervention. The biggest one that just kind of comes to mind for me is, can we track who we send pathogens to better? Because, really, it was not apparently not easy in either of these cases, and they really were just prepared to pass off the first one as food poisoning when it came up, or as just a weird outbreak, because weird outbreaks happen. So points of intervention, we could limit. Maybe we should have published the 1918 flu sequence. But that's, I don't know. It's more of a hard sell than you'd think it would be. There's watching chatter, and maybe especially cults. Like Om Shinrikyo was considering this at some point too, but the sample size is just too small to say anything meaningful. This matters, and I think this also matters from a, like, which companies get access to what samples perspective, but unfortunately it's politically fraught. Like Iraq, sort of when they were testing their bioweapons program, just sort of ordered things and just got them. Like, and they weren't allowed to, like, restrict their access to those things even, and like that all seems kind of concerning. And I'd really like better sort of DNA tagging or something. So for future things, I guess there's tracking who orders gene sequences, and there's no prior case, but I don't know if there's a ton of prior cases to look at for that. Just our current capacities are much more than they were 20 years ago, for instance. Monitoring, do epidemiologists even know to look for this? I think the FBI take it somewhat seriously because I think they're doing a fair amount of, like, community self-monitoring type stuff. Like I think they've talked to, like, some of the biohacker spaces, talked to some people who are running labs, that kind of thing. And that seems actually quite advisable. Like with the Rajneeshis, it was like internal divisions that informed them that they needed to check this place out. And it seems like that's maybe more effective than I thought it was. And obviously, like, if we all got sick less for other reasons, this sort of stuff would stand out more. Darn it, it was too big a slide, and then I switched it onto this. Give me 1 second to pull it the takeaways. Please don't have to turn it off. But overall, I kind of thought that this list just didn't catch a lot of cases. And I actually, how much time do I have? Wow, really?
Yeah.
I cut this way more than I. Okay, I have some additional slides then. So for government biowarfare, that's more targeted. Actually, let me just describe this bit first. I thought it made bad predictions about the shape of civilian bioterrorism, at least. It looks like it's you're more likely to both succeed at a small scale and also get away with it if you're using something that already exists, and it seems to be much easier to do that than I hoped it would be. So it relies very heavily on the assumption that it's targeted, I think, and this just doesn't seem to be that true for biology. Or like biology very much lends itself towards if you're willing to just have it be slightly untargeted, infectious agents can work for you, kind of thing. And so a lot of the model breaks down. And the assumption that the attack has to go through all of these steps didn't seem to hold up. Perimeter defense seemed to hold up as a useful viewpoint. Like the fact that it's so nicely meshes with hygiene said good things about it to me. But I think there's some bad assumptions baked into this thing, and I want to come up with something else, although I haven't come up with a better set of steps, and would at some point spend some time thinking about it. Yeah. And the ubiquity of low-grade infectious agents kind of leaves a lot of low-hanging fruit if you want to do very small-scale bioterrorism, which is kind of concerning. And we just haven't had any experience with the stuff that you might be able to do with more fancy tech, and because a lot of the stuff we can do now with Bio is just so new. And that's just legitimately frightening. But the model seemed to make some bad assumptions about how challenging different steps are, because for cybersecurity, each of the steps was actually a challenge for attackers and had meaningful adventures possible, and this just didn't seem to be true here. So I might need to develop a very different idea of which steps are required or which ones are important. And I think dropping the targeted assumption a little bit, is one of the important parts of how it ends up being very different. So government biowarfare, here's some quick case studies. These are, I think, the ones that I know the most about. Well, there's not always a ton. So Iraq's bioweapons program just tested a bunch of strains that they just bought from American Culture Collection and CFC. I think it covered things like anthrax. I think there were also a couple of viruses in there. Most of them, I think eventually ended up concluding that this wasn't the thing that they wanted. And I think there's, bioweapons sometimes seem to come up as a thing that people who end up eventually using chemical weapons tried, and it might be that it just scales worse. I'm not totally sure. It seems like, but it seems to me like bio stuff would work for like small scale things, but if you want to gas an entire subway, maybe Ebola isn't the best way to do it. And if you want it to like rig it to like set off under conditions, having to replace the material repeatedly probably is annoying. But this is largely speculation on my part. But it mostly just seems to be a pretty indiscriminate like weapon, and that's just always going to be a complaint about most of it. Anthrax is like more targeted than most, but it's still kind of a gas, sort of. And also it acts slow, and often you don't want that in war zones. But Iraq tried it out, and there's some kind of gross sounding stories. US tried it out, I think, before I think they closed it down in the 70s, but it went sort of late enough to be a bit surprising to me, but I don't think they ended up using it. Japan used just plague during the Sino-Japanese War, and yeah, it's generally quite cringy. But all these were using the pattern of using pre-existing infectious agents. Like, they used the word weaponization, but it might not have modified it all that much. And it looks like sometimes they, like, altered things about the delivery mechanism. Like, there's apparently a lot of aerosol science that can go into this. But it all comes with a major caveat. Most of these were newish. And yeah, like, it closed down by the 70s. Our DNA tech just wasn't that advanced back then. But I, for one, am very glad that we have, like, I don't know, very bad press around it, and, like, generally are trying to give a lot of international reasons to not do this. But I don't really, but I'm not totally sure of, like, what we are capable of at this point. Oh, yeah, this is more about the Nishi case. So initially they just thought it was a natural outbreak. Like, a politician phoned in that he thought it was probably them, and they were like, probably not. Like, local people are going to complain about the local cult. That's just going to happen. I don't think that means anything. But yeah, this is, I think, the bit I described about how he mentioned that his secretary had probably committed serious crimes. But the poisonings were in, like, 1984, and they didn't investigate the lab until a year later. They ended up finding a lot, like, described as bacterial freezer dryer for large-scale production, including petri dishes of salmonella, and also a copy of the anarchist cookbook and literatures on explosives and military biowarfare. And they suspected the group had done this kind of thing before. Yeah?
Well, where was this?
This was...
Oregon. Okay.
Thank you, yeah. And yeah, Irving's, I didn't look into quite as much, but it looks like sort of there was a massive huge chase in trying to connect it to Al-Qaeda, and then, like, they still thought there were 120 people who could have had access to the sample that he had access to, and, like, it was very hard to sort through. Like, there were not that many people who had been there at the start who were, like, still working on the investigation, I think, near the end. But in any case, I think that's it.